Okay. So the second question we had is, from these conditions, what themes, areas should we focus our strategy on, and or what strategies might you propose? Joshua and I have had this conversation. We wrote a piece about it a little while ago, but anarchists historically were the best at what they did. Like when people trusted anarchists, like carpenters, or like the longshoremen on the docks were looked to for leadership as anarchists and as leftists. And so in these positions, people strived to be the best they could because they wanted to show people, if we all do this as well as we can, we don't need the boss, we don't need the state. If we're all accountable to ourselves and to each other, then the whole idea of hierarchy and the whole idea of management is unnecessary in the way the capital sees it. And a really, really disturbing and terrifying and depressing thing is, it seems like the obsession today, whereas that may have been the obsession of workers of the past, and it comes from reading biographies and autobiographies of old anarchists and talking about how dedicated they were to the work they did, is it seems like we're obsessed with mediocrity and doing as little as we can and kind of getting by with being the worst that we can do. And I think that's true, and I'm going to hold to that. I think that's like a fact at this point in my experience in being in this milieu. I mean, it seems like, and this comes from, when I was a union organizer, it would come up, they would be like, well, there's a guy who works there who says he's an anarchist. Like, yeah, you may want to check that out. Like, he's probably the guy who shows up late and leaves first, realistically, and is trying to find ways of scamming everything and doesn't really look out for his coworkers, etc. That's not who we want. That's not who people to look to for leadership. And that's the person who's kind of giving us a bad name in the first place. So with this, my paid work, and what I, like my passion, what I care about is I work for Alameda County, which has this whole, we can just have a whole discussion about me working for the state later if people like. That's its own thing. But, I work for Alameda County at the outpatient, at the behavioral health care clinic. I'm an MSW. I do counseling and therapy, and I do case management stuff with people who suffer from mental illness and substance abuse. And I feel like we have a really interesting way of looking at people. We tend to have this thing called the stages of change. And it's a way of looking at where people are at and what's the proper intervention to use for that, where they're at. So if someone is what we call pre-contemplative, meaning they don't see a problem, then what you do is you engage lightly, you kind of offer them resources, you talk to them briefly, but you realize that they're not ready to move forward with change, so you leave them where they are. You say, okay, that person's not the one who's going to be going there, right? Then you have the next step, contemplate. People say there are some problems, there might be something wrong, and maybe I should be doing something, but I'm not sure, possibly, and they go back and forth. There's a lot of ambivalence. In that circumstance, we're going to focus on disrupting and kind of playing with that ambivalence to try and create more dissonance towards the person taking steps in a direction. The next one would be planning. People have decided there is something they need to change, be it take their medication, go to whatever, maybe stop using drugs, whatever it may be, whatever the issue is. People have decided there is actually a problem and they actually want to do something about it, and so you plan. There's a process for planning for these changes, and you go through this whole course of events, right? And then there's an action stage where you're actually doing these things. And after about 5 months, we say you're in maintenance because you're just maintaining that behavior. And there's a few things off that I think are really rich in terms of how we could look at anarchism. One is we consistently apply interventions as if people are at action stage when they might be contemplative about problems at best. And what I mean by that is we act as if everybody should know what we know, and if they don't, we attempt to bring them up to date in about 45 seconds, and when they don't come up to date in 45 seconds, we call them a fucking idiot and we write them off. And that's a regular occurrence. And that's something that I've seen done now it's been, 8 years, 7 years of being an anarchist? That's probably something I've seen over 100 times, easily. That kind of outlook at people, right? And that's highly problematic because you're expediting a process that we take years to get people to, or a year or whatever, and you're expecting people to get there in the time it takes you to order your coffee and have this conversation with the person, which isn't fair to them. And another thing that I think that's interesting about that is that I'm looking for people, if I'm going to use this framework, just for it's more interesting to me because of the work I do. I'm looking for people who are in that planning and at least contemplative and hopefully action stage towards organizing. Because to me, it's about organizing. We're trying to get people who are interested in making change. So either you think there's a problem and you want to make some changes, or you're trying to figure out how to make changes. Let's get these people in a room. More often than not, we're more interested in looking at people within the milieu who may be pre-contemplating. We're willing to spend hours and weeks and months trying to get them to move towards these stages, rather than looking at the person who you already see. You may see them at work, etc., who think there is a problem and desperately want to do something about it. But because they don't have a crass back patch, or because they don't know the finer points of, French anarchist theory, or they're not into what you're into, you continually write them off, or we do. And I'm guilty of this as anybody else, and it's a thing I'm desperately hoping to change. We continually write them off as if, because we'd rather have the kid we already know be with us on this one than the person who actually wants what we want. And that continues to fascinate me, because I'm like, do we want to lose that bad that we'd rather continually go there, that we're going to continue to waste time? If it was at work, we wouldn't get paid because they would look at a note that I wrote and say, you spent way more time than you should have on someone who clearly isn't there, and there's no way you're getting reimbursed for that because it's a waste of everybody's time and money. And the state looks at it that way. And we don't have to look at people as a waste of time, as a waste of time and money. We can certainly look at the amount of limited resources we have. I work 9 to 5. I leave work at 8. I get home 5:30. I take an hour decompressing. And that leaves me a very limited window of time in which I can work on political projects or political work or things that I care about and my passions. So in that time, in that limited time, where should I be expending my energy? Along with the obsession with mediocrity, that we're continually trying to pull punk or anarchist kids in who are in that and bring them to where we're at. But there's people right now, especially with the conditions Joshua and Cindy have laid out, like that we've talked about along the ecological crisis, especially with the economic crisis, people who realize that capitalism is just fucked and that they might actually be out of a job for the rest of their lives. Like, they don't actually know what they're going to do. They're budget cutting. The CSUs are taking, 2,000 less people next year per campus, I think, is what I heard on the radio the other day. Like, so you can't even go to school to get out of it and get loans to pay things off with for a while. Like, you can't get re-educated into something that you could do because there actually is nothing. We haven't created an economy for people to work off of. There's that much discontent, and we're still over here. Like, here is a huge mess and a crisis that anarchists should be completely engaged in. There's a crisis of healthcare, and there's a huge debate going on about, like, how are people going to acquire healthcare? With people getting continually ill, things happen, and especially now along with the economic crisis, people losing employer-based healthcare. There's how do we actually procure healthcare? What are we going to do about this? And there's this massive debate going on, and we're almost completely irrelevant to one of the probably 3 most important issues in this country today. Like, I don't even hear discussions about it other than the few nurses and other clinicians, et cetera, that I know where we have this dialogue. So in those ways, and in that kind of irrelevance is where we're sitting, which is the most interesting to me, because the rest of the world is adopting at least portions of our platform. Portions of what we actually put out there as anarchism are being adopted, even by things like Alameda County and Kaiser are adopting some of these things. And why they're adopting and what they mean to them is a whole nother issue. But the issue is that they're actually getting into these places, but they're not being discussed in anarchist terms, and they're not for the anarchist means that we're looking for. They're being used to reinforce capitalism, and to try and save the idea of capitalism for people. So that's, and with that, one thing I want to say is, like, my obsession is behavior and behavioralism and how people actually act and behave in the real world. Not what they say they're going to do, but what they actually do. So that's the other half of how what I do and what I work in and what my work is influence how I view anarchism and how we organize anarchism. Is I want those moms who don't just say they're in, but have real reasons to be in. You know, they just lost their job. And they're interested in anarchism. I want the people that Joshua runs into and works for, who are interested in anarchism and are thinking about these things critically and want to figure out how they can engage. Last night we were talking, and Joshua told me that one of his clients asked him about, like, well, what do anarchists do about the education system? Because their child is in a DC school and is tired of watching it fail African American children. And it's like, there's somebody who actually wants to do something about this issue. Now, what if there's other people who would like to get involved in this, and we can go from there? You know, there's a person who's actually exhibiting behavior towards wanting to change a situation rather than saying, man, that school system's fucked up, and then walking away from that question. And so that's kind of the way I view how we should figure out who's going to be in the room when we have these conversations about strategy. Is, are you interested in actually changing this? Are you interested in talking about it and realizing that North America probably is going to be a pretty decently nice place to live probably for the rest of our lives, I'd imagine. The ecological crisis could make that a little less fun. But we also have the First World Army to back us up. There's some international kind of alliances that'll probably have our backs if things get really bad. Am I out of time? Is that why you're looking? Actually, that's a good place to finish. I made my point.